Hey everybody. How y'all doing? I need a little bit more energy than that. How y'all doing? Everybody all right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. Socially awkward and raised in church. We need the energy. Beautiful, beautiful. Well, welcome to the panel on haunting. My name is Joshua Bennett, and I'll be, I guess, moderating today, but mostly just trying to think in concert with the brilliant folks that are up here and really have more of an open conversation towards the end about the thematics that bring us here today. Not just the work that's presented here, but how we understand it as a continuance of the ideas that are floating around the conference. So we can actually jump right in with Heath Pearson, who's going to present. He's here in the anthropology department at Princeton. He's going to followed right after by Zhaleh Boyd. Then we'll hear from Nyle and Wendell Woods. All right, in that order.
So my paper is called Rioting Culture, Order and Activism in the Wake of Police Violence. Round about midnight, New Year's Eve 2014, 2 Cliptown, New Jersey police officers shot 7 times and killed Jordan Johns. The entire murder was caught on dash cam and leaked onto YouTube. 3 activists responded. First, Sherry Johns, Jordan's mother, an older black woman who lives in Newark and works full-time with POP. Second, David Jackson, a middle-aged black man who is a retired corrections officer from Cliptown State Prison, who is the newly appointed warden of Cliptown County Jail, and who is the recently re-elected president of New Jersey's NAACP. And third, Jim Cantale, a 30-something white man who is a former high school math teacher, organic farmer, and first-time organizer. In our imaginations, I think police violences often manifest within urban landscapes. Cliptown, though, where I did my work, is a small rural town in South Jersey with only 25,000 residents if you count the 5,000 incarcerated. With eye-popping rates of police misconduct and killings of unarmed residents, with 5 correctional facilities in a 20-mile radius. It is now 85% non-white, but in 1980 it was over 65% white. Cliptown feels like the way prisons smell. And when we talk about the school-to-prison pipeline in Cliptown, it's not statistics, it's local scuttlebutt, like dishing about one of the 6 of 7 school board members who are also corrections officers. Yet, in my first 6 months of field work, I didn't meet a single person familiar with the phrase mass incarceration. And that's because mass incarceration doesn't accurately describe what it means to live in a prison or a prison town any more than the word activism describes what happens when we organize in the streets. I will follow the activities in this paper of 3 activists, the ones I mentioned, with 2 very simple organizing questions. Why did Miss Johns, the mother of Jordan, choose to work with an inexperienced organizer instead of the NAACP? And second, what does the riot, as it came to be called in Cliptown, show us about Cliptown's local order? So first, Miss Johns. I had lunch with Miss Johns at Applebee's more than a year after the shooting of her son. She spent the last 2 years organizing on multiple fronts in an attempt to, quote, convict the police officers that are out here murdering civilians. Excuse me, murdering unarmed civilians, she corrected. I'm so sorry you lost your son, I repeat and repeat, as Miss Johns folds and refolds her exhausted hands. What is it that motivates you to keep doing this? I think Jordan is in spirit and he's with me in spirit, and he's telling me, keep pushing, Mom. Tears stream down her cheeks. I just put on a front that everybody can see, but I'm hurting on the inside because I miss my son. I miss talking to my son. I miss calling that boy. I want justice and I want peace. I want peace for my son and I want justice for me. Jordan's shooting death happened shortly after I started research in Cliptown. And it's tempting to use police violence as a guide to explore Jordan's shooting death, since his death as an unarmed black man places him within a familiar category. But I'm interested here in the significance for Miss Johns, for Jordan, and for those in Cliptown that lived in, through, around, and after this murder, for those who still hear Jordan's voice. So what does justice mean, I asked. For me, justice means putting these officers away for life. We want you to join us before it happens to you. Well, not you per se, she points at my white face, but before it happens to anyone else. We're here not just for Jordan, not just for my son, we're here for everyone, 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 she emphasized 3 times. Now, let's meet Bert and David. A little bit of advice, my friend. Bert, my white housemate, scolded me one morning. Bert is a local pastor and president of a Housing First nonprofit, but he sees outside activism as being in conflict with his commitment to social political change, which only happens through long-term reform. All I'm saying is that it's a small town and people talk, he told me. And if anyone thinks you're sympathetic to activists, they'll cut you out. Sympathetic? What would happen if they found out I was one of the organizers? Thanks, I replied. But just as many people in town might find it problematic I spend so much time talking to you and your friends. He stared at me, but I had to be nice since he was taking me to dinner with David Jackson. We arrive at the restaurant a few minutes early and get our booth. David slides in right on time, his silky suit, black and white pinstripe shining like an Oreo. Bert was applying for community college president in Cliptown, and he wanted a recommendation letter from David. I wasn't actually invited to dinner, but I was waiting for a break in the meal so I could ask my questions. Finally, a lull. So, it seems like a retired corrections officer, he wasn't yet warden at this point, would have a conflict of interest in also being the NAACP president. Obviously you don't, so I'm curious as to why. Well, as a CO, I know most of the men in prison caught offenses as a kid, which permanently hurts their ability to get jobs. So right now we're working for full marijuana legalization in New Jersey, which will enable many to be released. Chewing his salad, deflecting. I'm all for abolishing prisons, I replied, but what is your employment and housing plan? This town is already suffering through 20% unemployment rates, and 68% of people live in rentals, more than double New Jersey state average. Not to mention how all of these released folks have to navigate lives around the Cliptown Police Department. This is a provocation conjured by Jordan. I want to push David. Unemployment and police violence are not abstract concepts. He bristles. Here's the thing. Of course, there are good cops and there are bad cops and there are plenty of bad cops out there, but the idea that cops are out to get black men is crazy. When a cop kills one of these bad guys, it's suddenly a national problem. Suddenly, he says. Then you have these protesters, these activist types, who just want to come in and riot, but they have no plans. They refuse to sit at the table and work to make things better. They just want to make a lot of noise. We all know Officer Fraze was not one of the good cops, but still, the riot? David and Bert are concerned with outside noise, with the riot, which is a way local leaders negatively brand organizers. For them, political engagement is a certain kind of ordering that changes not through disruption, but through proper procedure. And proper procedure ensures we can and will make things better, and that leaders already in power stay in power, if we follow Cedric Robinson. Thus, change happens not in the chaos of the streets, but around the quiet of the negotiating table, where local leaders gather together to talk sensibly. Now, if we mix Cedric Robinson with Carol Greenhouse, we learn how residents in small towns practice what I'm going to call conflict avoidance by placing a high value on harmony and individualism within a specific local order. This concern for maintaining order at all costs minimizes disruption by stigmatizing conflict as both lower class and by naturalizing the social hierarchies that exist. This marking of conflict then separates those at the top of the hierarchy who are responsible and self-governing, phrases we've heard for so long, from those at the bottom of the hierarchy who are irresponsible and incapable of self-governing. The hierarchy itself is naturalized in a way then that marks newcomers as the ones who are generative of disorder, in a way that masks the practices of leaders who are local, who work harder to maintain the current local order than to make the local order better for residents. Now, back to David and Bert, who opposed the riot or outside noise. By pointing to activists as those who refuse proper procedure, both leaders avoid direct action, thereby minimizing their own participation in conflict. Bert's advice to me was a warning, or perhaps a threat, against my own participation in local conflict. And David reiterates, we all know. Numerous questions surround the shooting and the relationship between the two, and we all know Officer Fraze is not one of the good cops, but nothing gets done through rioting. We know there are bad cops, he said, but when I get pulled over, I keep my hands on the steering wheel. He holds an imaginary wheel. I say, yes, sir, no, sir, and I ask if it is okay to reach into my glove box. Bad things will happen, that's inevitable, but live to fight another day. A sentiment that's understandable. Now, let's meet high school math teacher, small-time organic farmer, and first-time organizer Jim Cantale. I meet Jim at his home on a sunny, warm spring day. We sit in his side yard at a big wooden picnic table that is fading and chipping away its red paint. He smokes yellow box American spirits, one after the other, like a paranoid Thomas Pynchon character, and I decided to join him for the second one. His kids run circles around our table playing superheroes with lightsabers and baseball bats and sticks. For 9 years, Jim was a high school math teacher with 0 disciplinary write-ups. After the shooting, he and his wife organized with Miss Johns, Jordan's mother, in Cliptown. They had a very simple plan. Protest Saturday mornings in front of the courthouse and lead educational classes Saturday afternoons in another location. For 3 months, between 4 and 16 people protested in front of the Cliptown courthouse, never more than 16. Very small. And in mid-March, Jim was taken from class by 2 plainclothes officers and driven to his home, where his 3 children and their child care worker were being held. More than 10 officers roamed his property, barring entrance into his home. An hour earlier, his 4-year-old son accidentally dialed 911 while trying to call Dad at school. When the CPD answered, he hung up. A few minutes later, 2 officers showed up at their home and without a warrant pushed their way past the child care worker and the kids. They didn't touch anything but walked directly to the basement and pried open a locked room that had plants for their vegetable garden coming in the spring. Amidst those plants were 3 6-inch non-flowering marijuana plants, a ½ gram of dried marijuana, and a glass pipe. They didn't go through any other cabinets or drawers or rooms throughout the house or the garage, but illegally entered and walked directly to our basement vegetable room, Jim told me, nervously smoking. The week after his home was illegally raided, 2 things happened. First, a family friend who worked for the CPD called him nervously and said, I need to tell you something. 3 weeks before the raid, I saw multiple pictures of your wife hanging on the detective's office wall. Second, the CPD told the local newspaper they suspected 2 things. He and his wife had been physically abusing and molesting their children, and that he and his wife were running a large-scale marijuana business by selling to high school students. And the school board president of Cliptown, who is a lieutenant corrections officer in the state prison and is the president of the local NAACP chapter, also spoke against him to the papers and immediately encouraged the school board to dismiss him and revoke his New Jersey state teaching license. Remember, there has not been any charges at this point. So, Jim exhaled. You can imagine what people think when they read that a high school teacher has been arrested for intent to distribute and abuse of his own kids. Aggressive policing, according to Didier Fassin, is not about lowering crime rates or increasing feelings of security, but instead, the terror and humiliation of aggressive policing is a recall to the social order, and it is intended to remind each individual of her or his place. If we mix this with Greenhouse and Cedric Robinson, then we might understand aggressive policing as a systematized, state-sponsored inversion of local conflict avoidance, designed to protect leaders and to maintain local order. In Jim's case, the recall to local order had two results. First, since the Cantali family disrupted local order, the CPD enforced them into a lower class status and branded them as despised others. By the time the dust settled, Jim lost his job, his teaching license, his home, which was foreclosed, and their children were almost taken by the state. And second, all local protesting was effectively terminated in Cliptown. From what our friend told us at the CPD, Jim said, they were looking for a way to discredit us and shut down the protests, and they were successful, he says, smashing his fourth cigarette into the picnic table. In conclusion, despite the FBI and U.S. District Attorney's investigation into the shooting, the result for no indictment was the same as the corrupt county prosecutors, whose husbands are also corrections officers, that protected these officers in the first place. However, a few months ago, the CPD settled outside court for $2 million, as it has so many other times in town. And in fact, it is the second six-figure plus settlement with Jordan's family in the last 4 years. He was beaten unconscious by 3 corrections officers and left to bleed in his cell for 2 hours in 2010. So back to our opening questions. First, why did Miss Johns choose to work with Jim and not the NAACP? Miss Johns seeks peace and justice, which for her means convicting officers who are murdering unarmed civilians. So organizing and protesting, or rioting, is not simply about Miss Johns entering the streets to conjure the memory of Jordan and demand justice on his behalf. Instead, it is Jordan who conjures Miss Johns and other living out of our seats and into the streets. Jordan's restless spirit is an ever-present voice reminding her and others that the current Cliptown order anticipated his death, budgeted for it, and perhaps was created to assure it. And it is not the dead, but the living that need reminded of that reality. This is the culture of rioting. The living are conjured by the dead, who make clear, who demystify the order that is by refusing to let the living be lulled into the belief that this order is in any way natural. The riot of the living that follows the dead disorders local order. Toni Morrison remembers the black folks stolen, enslaved, lynched, imprisoned, and murdered by the mechanics of U.S. empire as the needy dead. But perhaps also it is the needy dead that push back, the dead that remember to conjure the needy living. The riot is necessary. When the needy living were conjured by Jordan, they did not only disrupt Cliptown's order, they lived out another wise. A small riot in the streets of multiple races, classes, genders, sexualities, and ages faced Cliptown police and local order, creating enough noise from only 15 people to produce an aligning of establishment activists like New Jersey's NAACP with local politicians, with the prosecutor's office, and with the Cliptown Police Department. And this alignment, whether temporary or long-term, was powerful enough to silence all protest and restore that order. Second, David and his colleagues as establishment activists are not doing the same work exactly as Jim or Miss Johns in Cliptown. Though David may speak in the abstracted tongue of justice, he is unwilling to follow the restless spirits leading the living to riot. Establishment activism in this case simply cannot or will not engage in this role. Thus, establishment activism in Cliptown strengthens the mechanics of local order more than disrupting it. Local leaders protect themselves by pivoting to conceptual categories like police violence and away from local encounters. Miss Johns works with POP and makes it clear that her work is an invitation for all to join, but she does not shy away from the demand of justice now. And she divines what justice means, convictions for these officers. So while an establishment activist like David will appear on MSNBC, as he told me in detail about his recent appearance on All In with Chris Hayes, to speak expertly about curbing police violence and bringing accountability to police departments, or to wax poetic about moral categories like good cops or bad cops, he refuses to appear locally in his hometown with Miss Johns and others to question the mechanics of the local order and seek justice in this moment and in this place. The local order is not up for debate. And David is not interested in unsettling it because his position in power is also knit into the mechanics of the order that is. And that is why we must continue to follow the restless dead as they conjure the needy living to keep fighting the order that is.
Next up, we have Zhaleh Boyd from the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation at the University of Hull.
Hey, y'all.
Hey.
Up there. Oh, maybe I just need it. Oh, I know what I can do. I would like to thank my co-panelists for organizing this conference and for work. Sir. There it is. Okay, thank you. Okay. Yep, we up. All right. Yeah, thank you, Heath and Nyle. Thank you so much for organizing this conference. And I haven't had a chance to interact with Dion Worthy, but I'm always so grateful for the work of women in academic settings. And I also want to give a very special and very joyful thank you to my sister, Dr. Ruha Benjamin, for hosting me and my beloved during this trip, and for in many ways encouraging me to continue my studies and be like her. My presentation is entitled A Particular Freedom, Black Death, Slavery Uprising, and the Intangible Army. And here is an overview. I'm going to talk first about ancestral memory, and then I'll talk about how this relates to African indigenous religious traditions, and then I'll get into my area of expertise, which is slavery and slavery uprisings, and then I'll talk a bit about some of the ways that we've retained some of those African indigenous religious traditions, and how we've reinterpreted the traditions in very contemporary and in very futuristic ways. One of the basic tenets of most religious traditions is that of co-presence, right? Of having your body temporarily host an entity other than your own. Catching the Holy Ghost, right? Speaking in tongues, whirling dervishes. In my own practice of the Baha'i faith, we call it sometimes being a hollow reed. But in African indigenous religious traditions, the familiar ways of hosting are to host familial ancestors, various other types of spirits, or the orishas, the deities themselves. This conversation is generally considered to be quite supernatural and even superstitious, but what I like most about it is how scientific it is. And I think we're often encouraged to think of those things as opposites, when in fact, they're two sides of the same coin. So in this conversation about co-presence, let's talk a bit about the Eve gene. Have you guys heard of the Eve gene? Nobody? A few? Who say yes? You? Oh, hey? Okay, so the Eve gene is also called mitochondrial DNA. You guys know it now. Okay, so in every single one of our cells, we have like our nucleus, which is like the control center of the cell, and there's DNA in there. And that's the DNA we get from like our mommies and our daddies, and they make us up. But then the mitochondria is this really funny looking little lady that lives in the cells as well. And she has another, well, she has her own job, but then she has another set of DNA. And that DNA, it carries the collective lived experiences of our mothers and of their mothers and of their mothers, all the way back to a common female ancestor who we'll call Eve. So while we're in the earliest stages of the womb and we receive chromosomes from both parents, there's a process by which the mitochondrial DNA deletes any information that comes from the father, which he got from his mother. So it maintains this maternal line. And the mitochondria has this very important job. Like I said, it has this other job, and it's the very human part of us that allows us to have sustenance. It converts what we eat into energy. So it basically allows us to sustain a physical self. And are there two things more connected in this world than motherhood and sustenance, right? So it's just something that's really interesting to me. So there's also something called the ovum overlap. Have you guys heard of this? The overlap. See what I did there? So we know that males produce sperm in real time, right? Like they make sperm every day, and then it matures and dies, and then they make some more. And as they age, their sperm comes out like it's representative of their experiences. But women, we make all the eggs we're ever gonna have while we're in the womb, and they retain their integrity throughout our, until the last one drops. So when our mothers are pregnant with us, ladies, our mothers carry not just whatever eggs they have left, but they also carry our eggs, and their experiences are being imprinted onto their grandchildren's, what will become their grandchildren's DNA, which I think is very interesting. So these things, these sort of physical co-presence things, have like a lot of different implications for biological co-presence that I unfortunately don't have the time to fully go into, but I just wanted to share them in here. So while we normally categorize, thing keeps telling me to join cable Wi-Fi. Okay, so while we normally categorize African indigenous religious discussions of co-presence or of possession in very spiritual terms, in my research for this presentation, the clergy of several of these traditions informed me of the very biological realities of co-presence. So on this slide are just a few Western studies into what the Babalawos and the diviners were teaching me. So first I'm going to talk about Dr. Sandra Peña de Ortiz of Puerto Rico, and she does clinical trials on memory. Western scientists are aware that short-term memory is made possible when neurons fire synapses that recall sensory experiences. The problem, however, is that this process doesn't account for long-term memory. There's no storage structure for long-term memory in that process. It's something that's baffled Western scientists for decades. Dr. Peña de Ortiz suggests that we have a blueprint within our neural DNA that maintains a record of every neural pathway created during a person's experiences. When we access long-term memory, we're accessing this record. And with every new experience, the record in our DNA is updated. So instead of thinking of DNA as something that is immovable, it's actually something that's very mutable in every moment. So Dr. Pena-D'Ortiz suggests that we have, I already read that, which brings me to Dr. Zizko Bose of Poland. He sought answers to Carl Jung's philosophy that humanity is just one single organism. And he suggests that in the womb, the process of ontology, or of coming into being while you're in the womb, sets into motion the process of phylogeny. That in the womb, every embryo goes through the entire process of human evolution. So in short, gestation is actually a learning process. Bless you, love. The womb is a school, and our degree in how to be a human is handed to us upon graduation from the womb. Back home in Atlanta at Emory University, Drs. Diaz and Ressler took the studies on genetic memory or ancestral memory on fruit flies, and they're applying these findings to clinical trials with mice. So if you look up at this diagram, I know the lighting makes it kind of weird. There's like a mouse at the top, and they train a set of mice to avoid a certain smell. I think it was like cherries or something. And then they mate that mouse with a mouse who has not been trained. And that offspring, the first set of offspring, without being trained, also avoids the smell. And then they mate that mouse with another untrained mouse. And then the second offspring also avoids that smell. Isn't that interesting? So it just sort of shows how these memories are passed on in our genes with no training, no experience. And that's about as far into biological ancestral memory as I can go, and still have time to get into my main point. So let's talk a bit about African religious traditions in the Americas. So here's a list of just a few of the African indigenous religions that are practiced in the Americas. And as you can see, there are quite a number of them. Some you might be familiar with, some you might not. But this map I also wanted to put on here just to show the diversity of African biological and cultural inheritance that's present just in the country of Brazil. Do you see, I'm about to go over here. We're usually taught that slavery in the US was just from West Africa. But as you can see, there's just a really wide variety. North America can fit in this little space right here. So, just imagine the diversity of biological and cultural presences that have permeated the rest of South America, the Caribbean, and North America. Wait, I have to close this cable thing. And then let's get into the slavery stuff, which is my favorite. So this is going to be the part on slavery uprising and liberation. I want to talk about 3 particular slavery uprisings and their connections to Black Death, African indigenous religion, and this intangible army. So let's talk first about Queen Nanny of Ghana. She was never enslaved, but she immigrated to Jamaica, and who very famously practiced obeah. There are lots and lots of legends of the ways she was able to utilize co-presence as a strategy for war, but here are 3 pretty well-known stories. Has anyone heard of Queen Nanny and the Battle of Pumpkin Hill? Or not the Battle of Pumpkin Hill, but Pumpkin Hill? Anybody? Okay, it's a really good story. So in 1737, the Maroons were just sort of like running out of food, they were embattled, they had gotten kind of weak, and Queen Nanny was getting a bit discouraged in their ongoing battle against the British. So she went to sleep, and in a dream, she was visited by some ancestors who told her not to give up. This sounds a lot like your story, right, of Jordan and his mom. So they encouraged her not to give up, and when she woke up, she had a pocket full of pumpkin seeds. So she went out to the hill and she planted those seeds, and within 1 week, these seeds had grown into these enormous pumpkins that fed everyone under her care, not just the soldiers, but everybody was fed off these pumpkins. The next story is that Queen Nanny could catch bullets. So these stories are spread mostly by the British and are quite derogatory in tone, so I'm not going to go into the details because they're dumb, but I have witnessed a ceremony personally in Sierra Leone that rendered warriors immune to any sort of harm from blades. And I'll talk about why I care about that later. And then there's a third story about a cauldron that Queen Nanny performed a ceremony on and placed in a very specific spot next to a cliff. And the cauldron appeared to have boiling contents, but it didn't have any fire under it. So when British soldiers approached it out of curiosity and looked into it, they fell in and disappeared, or they collapse and fall off the cliff. So these three stories sound fantastic, right? They sound supernatural, they sound superstitious, and perhaps certain aspects of these stories have been exaggerated, but the truth remains that a relatively small group of mountain-dwelling people with an ancestral co-presence as a primary strategy of war successfully held off the British for about 20 years during the mid-1700s. I want to talk next about Deti Boukman, or Boukman Deti. He was Jamaican. He was enslaved in Saint-Domingue. He practiced voodoo. And when he was brought to Saint-Domingue, he taught this tradition as well as literacy to his fellow enslaved community. Boukman very famously led the 1791 ceremony that is known to have prepared the entire community to enter into battle with the French. And this ceremony is pictured here. This is a famous painting of it. This African indigenous religious ceremony is credited for being the turning point that led to Saint-Domingue becoming Haiti, the only nation in the Americas to have experienced a successful wresting of power by the enslaved, and some would argue in the world. The third uprising I want to talk about is Gullah Jack. Anybody know about Gullah Jack? No? Anybody here? South Carolina girl? So Gullah Jack was from Zanzibar, and he was enslaved first in Florida, and then he escaped and was re-enslaved in Charleston, South Carolina. And he was a practicing African Methodist Episcopalian, and was also a Babalawo. Gullah Jack met Denmark Vesey in the AME Church, and they decided to work together on liberating Charleston from slavery. So he's said to have used his powers of co-presence to recruit a large army of enslaved people as soldiers. He also is said to have protected these soldiers with charms, and to have been able to keep people with knowledge of their plans from snitching. So, but if you know the history of Denmark Vesey, you know somebody snitched, right? And it ended in their death, in both of their deaths, along with other people. But I'm going to come back to that also. So we have these three very powerful examples of leaders who utilized ancestral memory in amassing both tangible and these intangible armies. Mainstream historical accounts tell us that these three leaders were not successful, right? And that their stories all end in death and supposed failure. Even Haiti's monumental revolution, despite being the catalyst for the entire revolutionary period and the end of the colonial era, is held up as an example of a failed state. But we're free, aren't we? Maroon communities still dot the Jamaican countryside. Haiti is not a French territory. It's an independent nation. And we know the outcome of our own civil war here in the US. So let's talk about death and uprising via the lens of African indigenous religion. Nanny Boukman and Jack died, sure. But let's consider the role of sacrifice or martyrdom in social change. All religious traditions have this idea that sacrifice is a vehicle for change. Are we willing to consider the deaths of these men and boys in a similar way? Are we willing to consider that the movement for Black lives was triggered by these souls' transitions from tangible to intangible existences? When we marched in Sanford and in New York and in Ferguson and in Baltimore, were we not witnessing the co-presence of these recent ancestors? So allow me to use that question as a segue into the ways that we retain and reinterpret African indigenous religious traditions into our very contemporary practices of connecting, protesting, and mourning. In African indigenous religions, there is a deity of war. His name is Ogun or some translation of Ogun. I want to suggest that we consider the term conflict as a synonym for war. In many ways, it's conflict that moves us forward, right? In childbirth, there is a necessary disruption. There's a breaking that allows for transition from that world into this one. And in our own lives, any period of growth is precipitated by a period of painful conflict. Any construction of the new requires destruction of the old. Ogun is not just the god of conflict, he's also the god of technology, which we also understand to be a catalyst of progress, do we not? So I want us to watch a brief clip from Ron Eglash's TED Talk on African fractals that will help to eliminate our understanding of the role of Ogun in the creation of the internet. And I was just given a time warning. Can I? Okay. Okay, I can cut this short maybe. It says media not found. Okay, well, I guess we're not gonna watch it. If you get a chance, check out Ron Eglash's talk on African fractals, and then remember what I said. Because what it basically shows is that binary code, which became the language of the internet, has its roots in African religious divination, which is really brilliant. So the internet is, of course, a tangible manifestation of humankind's interconnectedness and of its immortality. Do you see how binary code or African indigenous divination serves as our language of interconnectedness and our language of immortality, which you don't because you didn't watch the video. But go watch it, it's so good. So if we consider the internet to be a retention of African divination or of communication with the ancestors and deities, let's take a moment to reconsider the use of the hashtag through that lens. Hashtags are used to immortalize in a few different ways. One way is that a hashtag phrase can be recalled in every time and spatial context in which it has been used. The second way is that it's used as a gathering point, a rallying cry, an identification badge of solidarity. In the movement for Black Lives, we use the hashtags as a means for calling our recent ancestors, our martyrs, into co-presence with us. I briefly want to talk also about the retention of altars. So as you see here, here's someone practicing altar making and communication with ancestors at an altar, which is a meeting place for co-presence or a portal of sorts. And some ways that we've retained the altar are in the roadside death site altar. This was in Ferguson at the site of Mike Brown's murder. Or in the mural. We see one to Trayvon Martin. And we also have them in the RIP t-shirt, these sort of portable altars. In social media accounts, after someone has died, we continue to visit them at those spaces. And in the posthumous album cover art. So let me just review. My main points were ancestral co-presence is both biological and metaphysical. Ancestor worship is ancient, contemporary, and futuristic simultaneously. And that African indigenous spirituality's influence on global culture is vastly understated. Uh-oh, got this thing again. All right, thank you.
Now Fort, Department of Religion.
So I first want to give a shout out to Dion, for without whom this conference could not have happened. And I want to give a shout out to my mama, who wanted to be here, but is busy directing funerals today. She's a mortician who practices in Newark, where I live. And it's in my mom's spirit of what she calls a ministry of tears that I wrote this. On June 17, 2015, white supremacist Dylan Roof opened fire at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. 9 people, including Pastor and State Senator Clemente Pinckney, were slain in cold blood. A week after the massacre, President Barack Obama eulogized Reverend Pinckney to a crowd of over 5,000 mourners. The funeral, which aired nationally, demonstrated a distinct African-American way of mourning: open casket, call and response, pageantry, a unique synthesis of Jeremiad and Jubilee. The following day, 90 miles south of Charleston, activist Bree Newsom climbed a 30-foot pole at the South Carolina State House and removed the Confederate flag. Quote, "I was hoping that somehow they would have the dignity to take the flag down before his casket passed by," Newsom said in an interview after her arrest. But that day just further confirmed for me that we had to do this. Some ways of mourning animate political resistance. Others constrain it. This essay, or to be more accurate, these chaotic notes and narratives, situates James Baldwin's 1972 No Name in the Street in the wake of recent police violence and the ongoing resistance of Black Lives Matter. Barack Obama and radical BLM activists both employ the rhetorical repertoire of the Black freedom struggle in the face of premature Black death, but they urge the nation to mourn in radically different ways. In this essay, I argue that African-American mourning shapes how we think about the history of Black struggle, what we do with Black rage, and who the nation ultimately values. Published 9 years after his classic, The Fire Next Time, some critics claim that No Name represents a decline in Baldwin's writing. According to this view, the former darling of the white liberal establishment succumbed to an all-consuming rage. Quote, "What is ironic about the criticism of Baldwin during this period," Eddie Glaude argues, "is the refusal to take seriously what the dead might mean for him and for America," end quote. Confronting death and loss for Baldwin is not an exercise in despair. On the contrary, it is our only hope in remaking the world. No Name insists on an unflinching encounter with the wreckage wrought by legacies of injustice, not only to name what was destroyed, but to resurrect what remains in its wake. Histories of Black struggle. The Charleston massacre sits in a long history of violence against Black churches. President Obama said as much, quote, "It was an act that drew on a long history of bombs and arsons and shots fired at churches, not random, but as a means of control, a way to terrorize and oppress," he preached to a grieving congregation. A New York Times article called the eulogy, quote, "remarkable because it drew on all of Mr. Obama's gifts of language and empathy," end quote. But I argue that Obama's eulogy is remarkable not only for what it says, but for what it silences. Mother Emanuel is the oldest Black congregation in the South. One of its founders, Denmark Vesey, was executed for plotting the largest and bloodiest slave rebellion in U.S. history. Born in St. Thomas in 1757 and brought to Charleston at age 14, Vesey planned to kill the city's slaveholders, burn its buildings, and escape to Haiti by boat. He enlisted the help of over 9,000 enslaved Africans and even reached out to Haiti's leaders for military assistance. According to David Robertson, Vesey's plans, quote, "could not have progressed as far as they did without the organization and membership of the African Methodist Episcopal Church," end quote. So the church was burned down by a mob of angry whites because of its complicity in the insurrection. Throughout his eulogy, Obama highlights a particular history of the Black church tradition. Quote, "There's no better example of this tradition than Mother Emanuel," he preached, "a church built by Blacks seeking liberty, burnt to the ground because its founder sought to end slavery, only to rise up again, a phoenix from these ashes." He continued as the crowd rose to its feet. Notice, there is no mention of who the founder is or how he sought to abolish slavery. Obama affirms Vesey's ends, abolition, but he silences his means, insurrection. This is intentional. According to Samantha Monasone, public mourning rituals illuminate the political virtues towards which citizens should aspire. Obama's eulogy is about more than his gifts of language and empathy. It is about him having an opportunity to shape political behavior. by acknowledging Mother Emanuel's history of abolition, but erasing its involvement in Vessie's insurrection, Obama is able to authenticate his relationship to the Black freedom struggle while undermining the very radical politics of that same tradition. This is an example of what I call a liberalist politics of grief. A liberalist politics of grief. In the wake of racial violence, liberalist mourning affirms a history of Black struggle burdened by American exceptionalism. Rather than deny legacies of racial injustice, it grafts them within a broader narrative of national progress. From this view, the arson of Mother Emanuel, like the Dylann Roof's attack, merely marks a low point in the history of a country in the process of forever perfecting itself. A liberalist politics of grief necessarily suppresses histories of struggle that challenge the order of the state. That is why, according to Obama, Mother Emanuel was burned to the ground because, quote, its founder sought to end slavery. Not, let's say, because Vessie plotted the bloodiest slave revolt in US history. And let's not forget that Vessie, like many other Black freedom fighters, looked to the Haitian Revolution as a paradigm of self-determination and anti-imperialism. Obama's erasure of Vessie's insurrection represents a broader shift in African American politics. Cold War liberalism severely limited the scope of Black resistance. Black nationalists, communists, internationalists, radical feminists, and anti-imperialists who offered radical critiques of the state, conceived of freedom beyond national borders, and forged solidarity with decolonial struggles in Africa were deemed dangerous. The dynamism of the Black left fell victim to the push for Cold War consensus. So today, Black liberalism remains as the only legitimate form of Black politics. The history of Vessie's insurrection challenges the logic of Black liberalism. How? It rejects nonviolence as the only acceptable form of Black resistance to white supremacy, and it invokes a tradition of internationalism integral to Black freedom struggle. For the sake of time, I will focus on the former. Narrow stories of nonviolence constrain Black politics. In the wake of national moments of racial crisis, Black people are often pressured to publicly announce a commitment to nonviolence in order to soothe white fear of Black retaliation. And I'm thinking of Eddie Glau's book, Democracy in Black. I call this the civic pledge of nonviolence. We saw it most clearly after the killing of 2 on-duty NYPD officers in December of 2014. The shooting occurred in the heat of national protest around the non-indictment of Officer Daniel Pantaleo, who choked Eric Garner to death as he gasped 11 times, "I can't breathe." The shooter had no connection to BLM. Still, Mayor de Blasio called for a moratorium on protests until after the officers' funerals. Quote, "Two families are in deep pain, and our NYPD family is in mourning," he told the New York Daily News. Under pressure, some organizations responded with public statements condemning the shooting, and several activists canceled upcoming direct actions. This is the pledge at work, the policing of Black protests and foreclosing of radical politics. But not everyone listened to de Blasio. Quote, "You got no right to tell us when, how, and whether we can protest," activist Carl Dix asserted. In response to the ban on protests, organizations like Black Youth Project 100 doubled down on their commitment to speak truth to power. Quote, there's been no moratorium on the police murdering our people," a BYP member yelled at a rally held in defiance of the protest ban. The same day de Blasio urged activists to stay home, hundreds of protesters took to the streets, refusing to conflate the killing of 2 police officers with the pattern of police violence within Black communities. It is a moment best understood, I think, within a long tradition of militant resistance in this country that dates back to Vessie's insurrection. Not because protesters were violent, and here I'm thinking about Willie Osterweil's In Defense of Looting and his concept of not nonviolent, but because they rejected the call to law and order when it stood in the way of freedom and justice. This is what I call a liberationist politics of grief. Baldwin's No Name does not mention Vessie, but it foregrounds the broader history struggle from which the insurrection is situated. The essay not only recounts the heroic struggles of Martin, Malcolm, and Medgar, it also tells the story of the young Huey P. Newton, and the emergence of the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Baldwin was invited to host a fundraiser for Huey's defense. He accepted and even addressed an Oakland chapter meeting commemorating the 1-year anniversary of the Panthers' armed invasion of the California state legislature. Fatal run-ins with the police haunt the essay. Quote, "Black men and boys are being murdered here today in cold blood and with impunity," he writes. For Baldwin, police violence is not a matter of bad apples. It is systemic and fundamental to the US political order. Quote, "The police are simply the hired enemies of this population," he says. "They are present to keep the Negro in his place and to protect white business interests, and they have no other function," end quote. Panther history throws into sharp relief the repressive nature of state power. The fact that Black people need protection from police says a lot about policing in this country. No organization made this clearer than the BPP. Quote, "Nothing more thoroughly reveals the actual intentions of this country domestically and globally than the ferocity of the repression the Panthers have been forced to undergo merely for declaring themselves as humans." Baldwin was referring to the US government's all-out assault on the BPP as evidence in policies like the FBI's counterintelligence program. In June of 1969, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover made clear the stakes. Quote, "The Black Panther Party without question represents the greatest threat to internal security of this country." Just a few months later, Fred Hampton was murdered by Chicago State Police while sleeping in his bed. 17-year-old Bobby Hutton had already been gunned down by Oakland police, quote, "like a mad dog in the streets." Baldwin could not go to his funeral because 2 days earlier, his friend Dr. King was assassinated. Quote, "There was enough to weep for," he lamented. "So many of us cut down so soon." Premature Black death haunted Baldwin at every turn. Medgar, Malcolm, Martin, and their children. Many thousands gone. This is the wreckage Baldwin insists we confront, not to wallow in despair, but to, quote, "resolve that these dead shall have not lived and died in vain." Obama's eulogy employs similar rhetoric of Black freedom struggle that imbues Baldwin's writing, but it tells a narrow story of Black politics. Julian Bond calls this the master narrative of the civil rights movement. It is a linear narrative that commences with the NAACP and climaxes with Barack Obama. No radical critiques of the nation, no international solidarity, no mention of class struggle. Baldwin disrupts this popular story of Black political struggle. He tells a different story of those who paid the ultimate price for calling into question the very idea of America. Who's scared of Black rage? "Burn this bitch down," Mike Brown's stepfather yelled after a grand jury decided not to indict white police officer Darren Wilson. Wilson shot and killed Brown, who was 18 and unarmed, a few months prior. West Florissant was packed. Shouts of "fuck the police" pierced the cold air. By the following afternoon, at least 25 buildings in and around Ferguson were burned to the ground. Criticism of the violence and looting was swift, and it did not only come from the White House. Back in August, thousands of mourners filled Friendly Temple Missionary Baptist Church in St. Louis for Brown's funeral. The funeral, like Pinckney's, demonstrated a unique African-American way of mourning. Sounds from a Hammond organ shot through the sanctuary as mourners clapped and stomped their feet. Poster-sized photos of Brown wearing headphones flanked the casket. A St. Louis Cardinals fitted, which Brown wore when he was killed, resting atop. He had been scheduled to start technical school just 2 days after his death. This, mixed with the fact that the Ferguson Police Department left his body on the ground for 4.5 hours, seemed to raise the stakes. Quote, "All of us are required to respond to this," Sharpton, who eulogized Brown, insisted. "Hands up, don't shoot." Community members chanted outside the church as pallbearers pushed Brown's casket towards the hearse. It was 100 degrees in St. Louis, and the glacial climate was sweltering. The scene harkened back to the funeral procession of the slain civil rights leader Medgar Evers. Just hours after President Kennedy's national televised civil rights address, Evers was gunned down in his driveway. Baldwin was in Puerto Rico working on a play when he heard the news of his friend. Quote, "I just remembered his face," he wrote, "and the way he said road for road, and his telling me how the tatters of clothes from a lynched body hung, flapping, in the tree for days, and how he had to pass that tree every day." Protests erupted after Everett's funeral. Dr. King, who was assassinated 5 years later, co-led marches from the Masonic Temple to Collins Funeral Home, where Jackson police violently clashed with an angry crowd of over 5,000 mourners. There was no confrontation between protesters and police at Brown's funeral, but there was between protesters and Sharpton, in a sense. Sharpton's eulogy, like Obama's, is best understood within the funeral oration tradition. Less about good words for the dead, as eulogy is classically defined. Civic funeral discourse is about shaping the political behavior of the living. At Brown's funeral, that much was clear. Quote, "This is not about your rage," Sharpton said bluntly. Now, some say this is simply Sharpton reiterating the family's request for peace. But I argue that something else is at stake. Sharpton's eulogy, like Obama's, exemplifies a politics of grief that polices Black rage. I call this liberalist mourning. Within this frame, forms of activism that express anger are not only undesirable, but they are unacceptable. In the wake of racial violence, political leaders such as Sharpton, Obama, and de Blasio used family requests for peace to quell Black rage and constrain radical grief. There is perhaps no better recent example than the 2016 presidential election. Hillary Clinton has the compassion and understanding to comfort a grieving mother. Sabria Fulton told a packed crowd at the Wells Fargo Center in Philadelphia. Fulton, the mother of Trayvon Martin, was one of the 7 mothers who graced the stage at the Democratic National Convention. The group is known as the Mothers of the Movement, who I will refer to as MOM. Each mother has lost a child to police violence, and each endorsed Clinton for president. Clinton organized a private meeting with the mothers in November of 2015. Geneva Ville-Reed, the mother of Sandra Bland, who was found hanged in a Texas jail cell 3 days after being arrested during a traffic stop, recalled the gathering. Quote, "Around the end of the meeting, Clinton said, 'You guys really need to unify.' And that's what we did. Then she said, 'I will be getting back with you.' Clinton kept her promise. By election day, Mom had campaigned across the country for the would-be first woman president of the United States. But not all mourners who lost a child in a very public way followed suit. Samaria Rice, who penned an op-ed entitled "Why I Have Not Endorsed Any Candidate," wrote this about criminal justice reform. Quote, "These plans do not get rid of the trauma of knowing that my tax dollars help pay the salaries of the police officers that killed my son." Her son, Tamir Rice, was at the park playing with a toy gun when he was shot and killed by the Cleveland police. He was 12 years old. Both modes of mourning, I theorize, liberalists and liberationists, are activists in style. By that I mean they both employ the language and symbolism of the Black freedom struggle. They both articulate historical wrongs that are ongoing and pervasive, and they both call mourners to action. But liberalist mourning constrains forms of resistance that fundamentally challenge the logic of American exceptionalism, and does so by claiming the traditions of martyrs like Dr. King. Baldwin and radical BLM activists tell a different story, not only of King, but of the long Black freedom struggle that calls activist mourners to do more than just tinker with the system as it currently stands. And to conclude, I must admit that it's not easy to talk about the politics of a Black mother's sorrow or a community's loss. But I believe we do ourselves a disservice when we let those Baldwin called, quote, "the authors of destruction," decide the depth of our grief. We too say their names, say her name, say Ayanna's name, and Tamir's, and Trayvon's, and Rakia Boyd's, and Jerome Reed's, and Medgar, and Sandra, and the 1,800 and more whose names alone would take an entire conference to commemorate. For it is in our mourning of what Assata Shakur calls the death parade, that we discover the will to not only fight oppression, but to imagine a new world altogether. Thank you.
And to close this out, we'll have Wendell Woods from the drama department at UC Irvine.
All right. I include some thank you remarks towards the end of my PowerPoint, but I wanted to verbalize them first. Just thank you for the creators and co-creators and organizers. It's been an honor and a very educational experience being here, so I just want to thank them before I start. This is titled Dancing with Ghosts, Black Death and Haunting in Rickerby Hines' Dreamscape. And so first I want to open up and talk briefly about the play Dreamscape. It was written by Rickerby Hines. It's a hip-hop theater production that depicts the death in the inner life of a young woman, Maisha Mills. That's the character that stands in for a real person, which we'll talk about in a moment. The play is a meditation and a reimagining of the night of December 28th, 1998, when 19-year-old Tisha Miller was shot by 4 Riverside Police Department officers and left unconscious, bleeding in the car. So, I'm having video problems too. I know. So there was a clip I wanted to show, but hopefully through the presentation you'll get an idea of the style of the piece. The most important thing is his use of, Rickerby Hines' use of kind of a hip-hop aesthetics and a very minimalist production. There's only 2 people in the cast, the young lady playing Maisha Miller, and a DJ / coroner / beatboxer. So it's this really minimalist production. And we'll talk about some of the criticism it received because of that in a moment. So the play is actually based on the actual death of Taisha Shanae Miller. And as a kind of reference there, she was murdered by 4 Riverside police officers. She was found by her cousin unconscious in a car, and there was a gun in her lap. And when the cops arrived to wake her, they were frightened, and one of the officers who were frightened thought he himself had been shot, and they fired 23 times, and 12 shots entered her body. And so Rickerby Hines, in this reimagining or meditation, dramatizes each gunshot wound, and the bullet enters, it produces movement, and it makes her remember something. So in a sense, she's kind of remembered through this violent event that takes place all within a dream. And I think that's a powerful place to start. So this essay makes 3 analytical cuts into contextualize and trace the dramaturgical moves, as well as what haunts them. I look at 3 different things. The first, I interrogate structures of violence and their relationship to Black bodies, especially as they relate to our current times. I argue that Black death is a constitutive element of civil society and regulated by structures of violence that suture together the human world by tearing Blacks out of that very world. Second, I analyze the way in which Rickerby Hines employs a suspension of dramatic structure and form in order to meditate on the unthought position, by way of Saidiya Hartman, of Blackness in general and Black death in specifics. Hines disregards the confines, I argue, of Western realism, a form that would, due to its dependence on narrative redemption, foreclose on the possibility of witnessing Black suffering. In order to analyze Hines' dramaturgical move, I track the haunting that takes place in the play structure, where Black suffering and Black death seem to rupture even the dream hip-hop infused logic that he seeks to use to tell this story, a story that almost resists telling. The third cut is directly linked to the second one, in that I argue that what makes Hines' dramaturgy possible is his brilliant application and use of hip-hop aesthetics, which I don't really go into. That's a whole different essay, what I mean by that. But hopefully you'll get some sense of how he uses hip-hop to kind of rupture this narrative. I also argue that he uses layering and sampling, remixing, and these are central components of hip-hop, and they're able to blend perfectly with Hines' use of dream logic, which he sets up in his dream state. And together they provide an effective and creative intervention, able to meditate on and with life, a life that is haunted by death. I take Hines' courage to follow and listen to the ghost, and I too begin with the spooky question, where the spooky questions are posed, where the ghosts disturb the sleep and are animated by shadows, even emboldened to reappear, and maybe, if we listen hard, speak to us. Okay. So hopefully I've outlined kind of the general structure of it. And I'll just briefly talk about each cut I make. But first, I open the essay with a meditation on dream, and I bring in some dream theory, and I open with a nightmare that I would have as a child, and use that as kind of a space to begin the meditation. So I open the essay by saying, "Where to begin an investigation of Black Death, remembering and mourning, but from the unnerving feeling brought on by a bad dream, a night terror, slowly evaporating from consciousness, leaving the haunting trace, the always looming threat of return. What type of eerie dreams must have haunted Erica Gardner's sleep after seeing the looped images of her father strangled to death? If dreams constitute a unique window into trauma and its effects, what may be revealed from the dreams of Rachel Gentile? How many times has she returned in the darkness to that phone call? How might the appearance of death trouble the dreams of Leslie McSpadden, Michael Brown Sr., and Pearlie Gordon as they attempt to mourn and remember their son, her grandson, his body lying in the street, framed by yellow police tape, caught in news loops, a ghostly returning, circulating through the media, manipulated, rendered evidence of someone else's phobic fantasies? What dreams may come to Cody Gaines? What nocturnal visions of rescue voyages into the darkest depths in search of his mother? How does one deal consciously with loss? How does one find sleep or time to dream in the wake of so many senseless deaths? But why begin in a dream? And I ask that of myself in this essay, but also of Rickard B. Hines, whose play opens in a dream. Is there maybe something we can learn from the peculiar logic of a dream, from the metaphysical position of a dreamer, or perhaps a type of dream logic that can allow us to meditate on the unthinkable? Can the illogic of dream logic allow us to meditate on the paradoxes of Black existence, and by extension, Black death? So cut one is titled Blackness and Death, A Spooky Unbelonging. And I have up there quotes either from the essay itself or from other theorists that I'm kind of using to contextualize some of my thinking. There is something spooky about the correlation between Blackness and death, Black bodies and violence, the deathly haunting that subsumes Black bodies even before they appear. What Fanon might term their overdeterminedness is part of the strange legacy for those who exist in the world as negation. The Black body, always already detectable in its hyper-visible invisibility, is a dangerous possession and dispossession. In an anti-Black world, one is Black without given a second chance, a chance to prove otherwise, that is, to prove innocence. Black equals guilt. To appear Black is to appear illicit. The experience is decisive, Fanon reminds us, for one is not Black with impunity. George Zimmerman, who explains to the dispatcher, "We've had some break-ins in my neighborhood. and there's a really suspicious guy. Looks like he's up to no good, or he's on drugs or something. He looks black. Now he's just staring at me. Something's wrong with him. He's got something in his hand. What other type of body or embodiment provokes such anxiety, such deadly suspicion? Who most suffers from being so violently raced and erased by our deadliest fictions? Kind of sample with Spillers. This non-ontological ontology, to sample with Calvin Warner, that Martin Luther King Jr. strangely enough articulates when he says, a world in which blacks are harried by day and haunted by night, by the fact that you are a Negro, living constantly on tiptoe stance, never quite knowing what to expect next, and are plagued with inner fears, outer resentments, forever fighting a degenerating sense of nobodiness, from the letters from Birmingham jail. So this cut that I work on here continues to elaborate on that, the positionality of blackness. Let me shut this down. And how structures of violence kind of animate that. I bring in the works of course, Frantz Fanon, David Marriott, Christina Sharp, Frank Wilderstein, Tiffany Wilderby-Herrerd, Lewis Gordon, Sylvia Winters, Sadea Hartman, Calvin Warner, and many others to interrogate the way black bodies function as phobic objects in the collective imaginary. I also meditate on the representation of black death and the ways in which black suffering tends to go unregistered. Cut 2, Tarrying with Death, through a suspension of dramatic structure. This cut tracks Rickerby Hines' work and remembering of this story, a story that resists, I argue, traditional telling. Hines works to remain with the dead, to tarry with the deadly remains by suspending or dissing the demands of dramatic structure and narrative logic in order to provide a space or escape to wake the dead, to think and to mourn with the dead. What Derrida might suggest is a way of explaining our experience in life through death. Dreamscape opens in death with a dead black body, or with the ghost of a murdered black young woman, for a spirit needs a body in order to reappear as a specter. Hines' dramaturgy allows a haunting to become a meditation on blackness and death. Through his use of the dreamscape, Hines creates what Derrida might call a spectral moment, a moment that no longer belongs to time. It is here, and only here, that I argue that such an attempt to mourn can take place. If mourning, as Derrida explains, consists always in attempting to ontologize remains, to make them present in the first place by identifying the bodily remains, and by localizing the dead, Hines' dramaturgy works to provide a place of localizing, identifying, recollecting, and mourning what remains. This section also pushed back against certain criticism that argues that Hines prettifies death and doesn't take a strong enough political stance on police violence in this relationship to black bodies. And if you would have saw the clip, you would see that there is this abstraction and kind of suspension of realistic drama that I think kind of alienates you in a way to keep you more engaged with criticism of this structure rather than falling into sentimentality. But many people don't think that. So one critic argues that realism, Western realism, would be a more appropriate way to tell this story. And though I'm sympathetic to the need to not depoliticize black death and police violence, I argue that Western realism falls into the trap of suggesting that this type of violence is based on transgression, rather than a violence that is gratuitous. By doing away with Aristotelian structure, Hines actually, doing away with Aristotelian structure and realistic representation of violence, Hines avoids rendering black suffering into spectacle, while at the same time creating a structure that can meditate on the gratuitous nature of such violence without being restricted to a redemptive narrative. In this cut, I also evoke the concept of black time, which is another part of what I think Hines does. He suspends not only narrative logic, but temporality in the theater, so you're not quite sure what the causal chain is. You're kind of thrown into a dream world. And I think a dream world is a great place to be when thinking this, because dreams have a way of making sense out of nonsense. Even if it's not clear logic, you kind of just accept it as that being possible. And then the last cut that I make, It Was All a Dream, Hines' hip-hop aesthetics, just continues to forward my analysis of his dramaturgical intervention by focusing on how he utilizes hip-hop aesthetics to complement his dreamscape logic. I continue to build on the notion of black time and its manifestation through hip-hop, sampling, layering, remixing, and working with and within fragments. I argue that Hines' dramaturgy is aided by his masterful use of hip-hop aesthetics, and aesthetics that can deal with the paradox of creating black art in an anti-black world. I discuss the similarities between hip-hop aesthetic and dreams, and analyze the ways they both can deal with contradictions, manipulate time and space, make sense out of nonsense and out of fragments. As Stephanie Batiste states in her article, Hip Hop and This One Woman Show, hip hop exposes the ways our generation has dealt with the process of death, living, and being dislocated, disinherited, dispassioned, and deceased. So, in conclusion, I attempt to kind of rotate this kind of black vinyl grooves of my thought back to an earlier moment, and maybe isolate more of what I'm getting at by way of conclusion. And it reads, "But I've said little of Black Death. I have avoided it. What I have perhaps outlined is the position of blackness as one of social death. However, structural violence enacts actual death on Black people, from water-bloated bodies floating in the flood water of New Orleans and the aftermath, the afterlife of Katrina. One hears Aaron Neville's chilling falsetto exclaiming, 'They're trying to wash us away. Oh Lord, they're trying to wash us away.' To the murdered and brutalized Black bodies at the hands, batons, and guns of police officers and their junior partners. Willerson reminds us that one not need to list each and every ghost to be reminded of their omnipresence, to be haunted. If, as Calvin Warner points out by way of Willerson and Hartman, that the Black as an object is fungible, Hartman, and accumulated, Wilderson, and lacks coherent grammar of suffering, what does that say about Black death? What does it say of what does that say for Black dead bodies riddled with holes, photographed and dispersed through the trade routes of mass media? What does that say for mourning a death that happens, continues to happen, but remains outside of time? What Marriott might suggest is impersonal dying. I'm reminded of Fanon's closing sentence of Black Skin, White Mask, where he states, "My final prayer, oh, my body always make me a man who questions. In my attempt to conclude here, I pray that that my mind and body are always made to be haunted, nauseous with vertigo by such ghostly accounts, from such deadly recollections." This essay sought to linger with the spooky feelings, haunted by ghostly whispers of the dearly departed. Is it us, the living or the dead, that crave to be remembered? If we do remember them, may it be on their own terms. May we think with them, mourn with them, move with them, and let them move within us. May we tarry spooked, remaining steadfast in what Christina Sharp might call the wake, Wilderson would call the hold, and what John Mirilio would call the position of untime. We both sought to follow a ghost. Such tarrying forced us, Hines and myself, such tarrying forced us to listen, to witness differently. Causes us to think from a different type of thinking, a type of captive thinking, rather a captive meditation through dream logic, a cognitive schema of captivity, Dion Brand might suggest. I have attempted to point out the ways Hines infused his spooky logic with the hip-hop sensibility, I gesture in closing to the possibility of all of us attempting to think Black radical politics, engaging in a type of captive hip-hop illogic praxis to destroy and rebuild, rupture, disrupt, fragment, follow through and over contradiction, and as Heath said earlier, to disorder the local order, to disturb tradition, to sample layer, to remain fluid, to disform, to recreate the possibilities, and most importantly, to find the rhyme and reason needed to, as the social critic Tupac Shakur says, fuck the world and all its anti-Blackness. Thank you.
So I'm gonna keep this pretty short, just so we can hang out and ask questions from the panelists. Thank you all, actually, for dynamic, thoughtful presentations that bring us back to the flesh. I think it's important. There were real people in those talks. That matters a lot. So I just wanted to start, actually, with the words of Gwendolyn Brooks, right, who writes that my best allegiances are to the dead. So I want to think aloud for a bit about the house I grew up in. My mother's claim that it was inhabited, at least when we first arrived, by what she called, quote, familiar spirits. She never used the word ghost or haunted, but instead offered that there was some sort of other non-human spectral presence that had taken up residence in our home long before we'd ever set foot in the place. It bears mentioning that both my mother and older sister recall this presence not as some sort of Hollywood ectoplasm, to use an Ellisonian phrase, that might appear in a transubstantiated humanoid form, but rather as the sound of footsteps, creaking floorboards, everyday objects moving in the wake of a body that held neither flesh nor bone. Now as then, I'm fascinated by the use of the phrase familiar to describe the contest staged between the dead and the living in my childhood home, a conflict that ended only when my mother, it's a true story, decided to anoint a broom with oil and physically sweep the spirits out of the basement and through our front door. We never heard from them again, but I have the sense that this narrative bears the trace of a more general concern that is shared by most of the presentations we have heard today, i.e. the relationship between the familiar and the familial, the wounded kinship held between the people who are called Black, those who are said to be dead already, and here I'm thinking not only of Orlando Patterson's off-cited vision of social death, but Colin Diane's civic death and Achille Mbembe's necropolitics, and those who we might imagine to follow Stephanie Smallwood as the dead living, our ancestors, those who have gone on before and yet remain among us. What do we owe the dead? And how might we collectively develop a critical vocabulary that honors the historical and epistemological stakes of that question? How have peoples across the African diaspora historically thought about the distinction between life and death, as well as how such a binary might be opened up or altogether eradicated in favor of more radical imaginings? Death as a species of life. Life and death not as irreconcilable antipodes, but rather nodal points within a much broader spectrum of being and becoming. Furthermore, after working through the pre-circulated material, my mind kept returning to a Terrence Hayes poem from his most recent collection, How to Be Drawn, entitled Black Confederate Ghost Story, which is essentially a petition for the return of the ghosts of Black people that were lynched throughout the 19th century. Hayes writes, "Attention, apparitions. This is a solicitation very much like a prayer. Your presence is requested tonight when a man is polishing his Civil War relics and singing Good Old Rebel Soldier to himself. Hello, sliding chairs. Hello, vicious, whispering shadows. I'm a reasonable man, but I want to be as inexplicable as something hanging a dozen feet in the air." My mind immediately jumped to this passage for many reasons, but I want to hone in on Hayes' use of the term presence, which has been on my term for some time now, in part because I wonder whether haunting, as so many of us have been trained to think of it, is the most useful language for the phenomena we're thinking through in this panel and elsewhere. Perhaps what we are after is something ineffable, inexplicable. Much of my own work is concerned with the presence of vermin in African American literature, And in the writings of someone like Richard Wright, for instance, pest animals often appear as hauntings, rats running through the walls or under the floorboards, in moments where one could argue that they are simply engaging in banal activity, minding their business, and present no real threat to anything other than dominant ways of thinking ownership and dominion. I'm interested in how we can trouble that sort of misrecognition in terms of how we think and describe the role of non-human actors, both dead and alive, in our own work. How we can continue the sort of thinking I see here, which imagines all sorts of social and political possibilities as it pertains to the relationship between the living and the non-living. Put differently, for those of us who have decided to cast our lot with the corpses, the undead, the ghosts and familiar spirits, what other resources at the level of language are available to us? What sort of conviviality or collaborative vision? The work of imagining the end of the world will require an altogether different metaphysics than what we have inherited from the Western philosophical tradition. It is my sense that the instruments we need are already here, already among us, already warping our relationship to a social order that depends upon Black suffering for its very sustenance. Thank you. And from there, I think we should open. I have individual questions for all the panelists after hearing those presentations, but I want to open the floor so it can be a more robust back and forth. Thank you. And do we have a microphone? Oh, amen. Is that someone passing out a microphone? Are you just leaving, Yanni? I'm sorry, I just called you out. Okay. Are you fine as projecting?
Sure. Can you hear me?
I can hear you fine. Do we have no microphone? Okay, bless it.
So I have
Here.
two questions. One for Wynn and the other for Zhaleh.
Zhaleh.
Zhaleh. Perfect. Okay, so Wynn, I was wondering, have you thought about how the opening of death programs take place, which I've seen, how the opening parallels with or thinking about the opening with death alongside like the actual logics of social death that we did from the African school about but also how have you thought about Taisha Miller's narrative and the time that this place was produced alongside what is now becoming like, I don't want to say common practice, but there is this movement towards creating films about Black death, and Taisha Miller's story is just now being turned into a film. I think we recorded it earlier this year that it's going to be turned into a film. But the play was produced before Oscar Grant's movie, and the narrative that's associated with Steve Biles is about him. So I wonder if you thought about it in terms of those politics. And then, Zhaleh, your presentation was so awesome. Whether or not visually sense. But when you were talking about DNA, my immediate question, I think you characterized or described the womb as a school on how to come into being. And to me, I mean, that can be read a number of different ways. And I'm wondering, are you thinking, I would love for you to expand more on that because I'm curious who you're thinking with. Because there are a number of people participating in the discourse who describe Black women's wombs as not the safest space for meanings. And I'm being very vague, but I'm sure there's something else.
All right. Thank you for the question. I'll approach it kind of in two ways. The one is opening in death or with death for me is a way to kind of rupture the narrative logic that could take place in this. And it's not a flashback to death and then a return to the moment before or anything like that. It exists in the space, the time space of death, literally in between the first shot that enters her body and the last one. And at no point is there any type of narrative logic that says we started out in equilibrium, dramatic event, disequilibrium, return to equilibrium. We're kind of in this secular black time, I think is the best way I can explain it to a few people. So I think I'm nervous when I hear it go into film, unless it embraces the same type of illogic as logic that would rupture the film narrative. But a Hollywood film is going to fall into redemption narrative, which I think is going to foreclose and erase any attempt to listen to Black Self. So hopefully it's an experimental film. I'm thinking of that director, something Khalid. He did the Vincent. Yes, something along that line, where it's actually a space that's so kind of engaged in the paradox and moving through almost a fugitive aesthetic, that it doesn't say, oh look, could be simply solved with body cameras, and that's the end of this thing. And I think the story is all the officers got acquitted, right?
Yes, they all got acquitted and they got paid out.
Yeah. I think the statement was, it was a bad mistake, but not against the law. And I would hate to see the film be a bad mistake and not against. I think try to tell it through dramatic structure. I hope that
Thank you also for that question. So the Womb as a School idea came from the Polish guy that was up there, Cisco Bausch. And I mean, it didn't come from him, but it's something that he touches on. And this idea that, it's sort of going against this idea that being born is a forgetting. And that we are actually born with a vast amount of intelligence and know-how. We know how to breathe. We stop smacking babies when they come out, right? We know how to find our mothers. We know how to seek warmth. We know a number of things that will help us to survive. And to dismiss all of that knowing, it really doesn't do justice to becoming human, right, to that process. And it also just sort of helps to further on this idea that babies are stupid and whatever, like that they are property and all this kind of stuff. So I think I can send you also my references if we exchange emails after this from all my research for this. But also this idea of wombs being unsafe and Black women's wombs in particular being unsafe is something that is just heavily patriarchal, heavily racist, really doesn't hold water anywhere for me. Like, it's something that I hear a lot, and I just think it's really dumb. I mean, that it doesn't make a lot of sense because it pretends that womanhood, as it is in the society, exists in a vacuum, or that the idea that we would have a choice about participation in our own body's birthing processes are not informed. Like, we don't, as if we don't know what's going on with our own bodies when we decide whether to have or to not have a child, or how to conduct ourselves during pregnancy. And it, just like with those babies in the womb, pretends as if we are just completely devoid of intelligence.
Yeah, but I was also interested in so Christina Sharp, in the way describes the Black woman's womb as a second passage. And I'm still thinking about that, like trying to determine, is this a part of that discourse that has been that way since the 70s, or is this something else? Like, really thinking about discourses about the sex, or about the middle passage and what that means. Like, I think in the text she specifically references Frank Williamson and Constance Spillers, and that stages a particular type of discourse that is about reproducing Black death or reproducing social death.
Yeah, that's something very different than what I was thinking of. That's something I needed to think on too. Thank you.
I have a question for Nyle and for Dell. So for Nyle, so President Obama and Al Sharpton, they both have stakes and taking on some of these liberalist practices. I'm curious about whether your paper accounts for everyday pastors who probably share the same politics of Barack Obama or Al Sharpton, but don't have the same status or power. Like, what's their stake in having those practices? And for Wendell, in your first cut, you talk about blackness as skilled blackness as perceived illicitness. And I'm curious about that framing, always because we talk about like driving while black versus policing while racist. And so I'm curious if there's a way we can center whiteness, because we're always going to have to be rehumanizing black people, undoing how they're perceived. Is there a way that, you know, we can have a discussion about centering the oppressor that undoes being racist versus trying to rehumanize blackness?
I appreciate the question. So this paper does not address that, but I'm interested in that for like further work. So I'm interested in doing ethnographic work around funerals, particularly in Newark, but in other black working class and poor communities. And so that's a question that I have as well. My sense would be that there would be something I would call liberalist mourning, but it would be for different reasons. And one of those reasons would be a kind of story we tell about religion in the black church, right? A kind of evangelization at the moment of black death, right? So you have young people come into the funeral, RIP t-shirts, you know, it's African American mourning all the way down, and the pastor gets up, and instead of sort of thinking about this and politicizing the moment, it gets depoliticized through a story about coming to accept Jesus or something like that. And so I am interested in that, but this particular paper doesn't address that.
Wow, thank you for your question. I definitely hear it, and I'll think through it, but I think I can offer from maybe a theater background, producing work that allows for any audience to truly meditate, but also forces us not to maybe enjoy theater as much as we want. So I think there is a way to create story and to share story that doesn't fulfill the desire to either spectacularize black suffering, but kind of places us in a place where we all have to kind of meditate and negotiate it without easy answers. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think as far as theater that I'm interested in, theater that I want to produce, it could have that way of, let's not focus just on, you know, the positionality of blackness. Let's focus on ways that we can, as allies, or people as allies, can truly interrogate the structural realities and be uncomfortable with not having solutions at the end of the play.
Just real quick, especially for Zhaleh, but I think I can open it up to the full panel. I'm in the mental health field, and this idea of trauma has been like the new, like, hot everybody wants to be trauma informed. And it's just this idea that people come in from clients to professionals to, you know, anybody interconnected that might have this trauma. And so this idea of like carrying memory, or this evidence of actually carrying memory in our DNA. Like, I'm thinking about the study that was recently done for the descendants of Holocaust victims, and they found that the trauma is actually in their blood, in their DNA. I'm wondering what that does, what this idea of memory does in light of like these memories, in light of like the death that like the generations now are currently carrying, even the generations after them will carry in what kind of institutional or political implications that you might see in the future coming from the kind of work that you're doing around memory.
I can go first, and I welcome anybody else to get in on this too, but I work in human trafficking, so trauma-informed care is something that I'm really passionate about as well. So thank you for bringing that up. what I hope is that the two things will grow sort of at the same time and inform each other, right? That the better we get at caring for our traumatized will be informed by the better we understand how trauma works and what it does to our bodies. I just participated in a study on long-term trauma, because in human trafficking, sort of like aftercare, the furthest we go is 5 years. And the effects last, we all know, forever. I mean, and they show up in the craziest ways, you know, in all of our organ systems. So that's my hope, but it's also possible that they'll attempt to preclude each other or to obscure each other, you know, that if you are talking about a trauma that you experience, that it will be preferred or that it will be subverted, you know, or in any way compared to ancestral trauma. And I think that one thing that we really need to learn how to have nuance around is this, the way that we sort of seek oppression Olympics, I guess, and sort of try to have a default setting or like a standard for how people handle their trauma. If it looks like this, then it's traumatic enough for us to care about. If it looks any other way, get over it, right? So that's sort of my fear.
So we'll close there. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the panelists.